All right. So yesterday we sort of previewed this information. We considered what the country looked like at the turn of the 19th century here at 1800, how much territory there was up for grabs, and the country is really on the cusp of changing things. Period three was all about building the U.S. government, and period 4 is really going to be about how the United States comes into her own. How do we develop our economy? How do we develop true national unity? And so on. So Thomas Jefferson, of course, is going to be the president elected in 1800, and it's really a revolution. And you might think that that's sort of like exaggerating a point, and I hate to link it back to 2016 politics, but here we go. One of the really cool things about the election of 1800 is this. Well, it's two cool things, actually. The first of which is that when Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans won the Electoral College in 1800, the Federalists just accepted that, right? They didn't, riot in the streets or call for, like say that there's widespread corruption or say, how dare these people win? They're not the party of Washington and therefore they don't deserve to have power in our country. They just accepted it and moved on. But I want to tell you how that managed to continue as like a precedent, because the Federalists could have accepted it and then the Democratic Republicans could have screwed everything up. And then going forward, would the Federalists have continued to believe that the system was fair? No. So the second half of the equation is this. When Thomas Jefferson enters office, he could have fired every single Federalist person in government, every Federalist bureaucrat, every tax collector, every State Department official. He could have fired them all. He could have replaced them with people who were loyal to him. That's called patronage. I think. The patronage system is this idea in which we reward people who have supported us politically with jobs in our government. So Jefferson could have followed patronage to its extremes and filled every position with loyalists, regardless of their loyalists to him, that is. So Democratic Republicans, regardless of their qualification. He could have done that, but he didn't. And so in 1800, this is the first glimmer of hope for American democracy, right? Or maybe I guess the third, but I think this one's the most important. When the Articles of Confederation Congress had their success, what was it? The success of the Articles of Confederation Congress? Northwest and land ordinances. There was a little glimmer of hope. Hey, a national government given sufficient power could actually be successful. When George Washington faced the first challenge to the new constitutional republic, what was it? The Whiskey Rebellion. When George Washington faces the Whiskey Rebellion and successfully restores order, another little glimmer of hope. Okay, people are going to follow along. We're going to have enough power to do this now. But now, in 1800, here's the real test. When people lose power, what will happen? Are they going to be persecuted? Because quite frankly, Adams set a terrible precedent about what you do to people who aren't in power. What was that terrible precedent of the Adams administration? The Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Adams set a terrible precedent about what happens when people aren't in power and how politics can be used against them. And Jefferson and the Republicans, they could have done that too. But they didn't. And so here is a really important big progressive step towards America. But anyway, so Jefferson comes, and one of the quotes from his inaugural address says this. He says, I place economy among the first and most important of Republican virtues, and public debt as the greatest of the dangers to be feared. This is a jab at somebody. Who's he jabbing? Absolutely, Alexander Hamilton. So Jefferson believes that debt is this great evil that our country is facing. And so one of the first things that the Jefferson administration does, together with the Democratic Republicans in Congress, is to repeal a whole bunch of stuff. So they're going to significantly reduce the government's involvement in trade, reducing the regulations between interstate trade and reducing tariffs. They're going to significantly reduce the number of federal employees to try to reduce the size of the government. And they're going to do their very best to pay off debts as quickly as possible and not to incur any more. So Jefferson is going to begin shrinking the size of the national government back from the sort of big expansion that happened under Washington and Adams administrations. That being said, Jefferson finds himself in an interesting quandary when it comes to ideology, when the question of the Louisiana Territory is raised. Who owns the Louisiana Territory in 1800? France, right? They had just recently gotten it from Spain. Very good. So now France has Louisiana Territory, and Jefferson is nervous. What was the most important port in all of the United States at this time? It's New Orleans, and I want to remind you why. Because it was literally cheaper and faster to take, I don't know, my bushel of corn or something, load it up on a cart, so let's say I'm here in central Ohio, load it up on a cart, take it to the Ohio River, then put it on a barge, float it down the Ohio River, down Mississippi, out the port of New Orleans, onto a ship, out through the Gulf of Mexico, up the Atlantic seaboard, and then landed in New Jersey or New York or Maryland. That was faster and cheaper than simply taking it overland the same direction. Can we just appreciate that for a minute? People literally drowned in potholes. There are contemporary reports of people talking about their loved ones who went missing and they were found drowned in a pothole. Roads were little more than trails, just wide enough for horses and potentially a cart behind them, cut through all kinds of rough terrain. You had to scale mountains in the process. Transportation is really rough, y'all, in 1800. This is not like modern interstate highways or anything like that. So the Port of New Orleans was really important. And so as the Louisiana Territory has now changed hands, we had felt comfortable with our position in New Orleans because of why? What former old agreement had given us a happy place in New Orleans? Pinckney's Treaty, very good. So we had Pinckney's Treaty, we felt pretty good, but now the Spanish gave it away and somebody else is in control. So Jefferson is worried. He says, you know, we need to get real control over New Orleans. We can't leave it up to chance. We can't have to worry every time it switches hands. So he sends an emissary to go to France and try to negotiate for the purchase of just the Port of New Orleans. Just one city. That's all he wants, just one city. But he gets there, and forgive me, I'm not good with numbers and don't remember. I think it's 15 million, but I have no earthly idea. So you guys could just fill in whatever number works for you. He tells his emissary, he says, go and negotiate for the Port of New Orleans. And he actually, if the final purchase price, which I kind of think is 15 million, if that's the final purchase price, he gave his emissary like a cap of like 10 million. It was something just a little bit less. So his emissary gets there and says, hey, we'd like to buy the Port of New Orleans. And Napoleon basically says, hey, how about the entire Louisiana purchase for just a little bit more? And the guy's like, well, right, a little bit of that. So he sends word back to Jefferson, but there's a quandary. I told you there was a quandary in the beginning, and can anybody figure out what the quandary is? Well, how does Jefferson believe we should interpret the Constitution? Strictly, right? Strict interpretation. Strictly means what? If it doesn't say we can, then we can't. Where in the Constitution does it say we can buy a whole bunch of new territory? It doesn't. That's right, it doesn't. So he believes that he doesn't actually have the authority to buy this huge block of territory, right? He thought that he could kind of justify New Orleans because it like touches already existing U.S. territory, and so he's simply just basically creating a treaty to secure access to this city or something like that. And he doesn't think he has the authority to do it. But how can you pass up doubling the size of your country? Well, it would be very difficult to do that. So Jefferson does it. He says, okay, fine. He gives him the permission. He gives his emissary permission. Go ahead, accept the offer. We'll give him the money. Fine, we'll take the territory. And then Jefferson writes his letter of resignation because he truly believes that what he's done is unconstitutional, and he feels certain that the people are going to call for his resignation. Meanwhile, his fellow Democratic Republicans are going, are you kidding us? We're not going to ask you to resign. You just made us the most popular party ever since the history of this country, which was only 20 years ago, but whatever. They're really excited about it. They don't have any qualms. Meanwhile, the Federalists are really irritated because they can't exactly say, this is unconstitutional. You can't do that, because they're all the party of loose interpretation of the Constitution. So Jefferson scores a political victory here, but it's also going to be a really big victory for our country, right? It's a whole lot more territory for us to deal with. He's going to send out Lewis and Clark, this part of the story, to explore it and figure out what's there, because they're not really sure what it is that we bought. We just know it's something important. But then we get into a bit more complex, or more of a complexity here, which is that Jefferson then decides that the Louisiana Territory, although there's enough people in the Louisiana Territory, particularly in and around New Orleans, to have an official like territorial assembly. They could like elect their own and have self-government, and then pretty quickly have enough people to apply for statehood. Jefferson doesn't think that it's a good idea to let a whole bunch of former French and Spanish people all of a sudden be part of U.S. government. And so he says we're going to appoint them a governor. They're not going to have self-rule. We're going to appoint them a governor for a period of time. And that's a little bit weird for a Jeffersonian Republican, right? I mean, the Republicans are supposed to be all about state power and like no national rule, and power is supposed to be kept close to the people. So again, I think what Jefferson is revealing to us is that he is not an ideologue. He's going to do what he thinks is best for the country. And that is really important. In the same way that Washington, as a precedent for our presidency, was important, Jefferson is setting a lot of important precedents as well. So I'm going to skip this for a minute. In 1803 then, the same year as the Louisiana Purchase, we're going to see another really important political development occur, which is the decision of the case Marbury versus Madison. The decision of the case Marbury versus Madison. So in this case, here's what happens. First of all, back up to 1800 and the election of Thomas Jefferson. Who was the president before Jefferson? Adams, right? So Adams knows that he's out of office, but what was that law that had created a whole bunch of new lower courts? The Judiciary Act of 1790 created a whole bunch of courts, and so Adams wants to fill them all up with Federalists, with people who see the Constitution the way that he does. So he's making all these appointments, and he makes them, it takes, of course, remember, information can only travel as fast as a horse, right? So the idea of gathering information about who to appoint and to get the information out to them takes a while. But anyway, he's literally making appointments up to the night before Jefferson is inaugurated, literally. So a few of them, he doesn't have time to deliver. He can't, go out in midnight and deliver his appointments. So a few of them he signs, he seals them with the seal of the president, and then he leaves them for the incoming Secretary of State, that's going to be James Madison, to finish, to just deliver them. They've already been sealed, they're technically official, you have to give them out, and so that people can to assume their positions. But do you think Madison's going to deliver some Federalist appointments? No. So Madison refuses to deliver them, and one of the guys, his name is Marbury, James Marbury, I think, but I don't really remember that part. This guy Marbury, he sues. He says, I was told by John Adams that he appointed me to this position, and you need to give me my appointment so I can take my position as a judge. And Madison goes, no. And so it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now here's the complicated part. The Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1803 is a guy by the name of John Marshall. You're going to want to know his name. He's really important. John Marshall. So John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at this time, and he is a Federalist. You want to know that too. John Marshall, a Federalist, is the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at the time. So as a Federalist, does he want Marbury to get his appointment? Yes. Marbury is a Federalist, appointed by Adams, who is a Federalist. John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, is a Federalist. He wants him to have it. But here's the thing. Marshall feels that it is really important for the U.S. Supreme Court to be able to have a real role in politics. And what is the way the Supreme Court today has a real role in politics? Through the power of judicial review, right? Through the Supreme Court's ability to look at laws of the states and the national government and decide whether or not they are constitutional. But that's not in the Constitution, y'all. It doesn't say that anywhere. So Marshall wanted to assert this power. It was in the Federalist Papers, a few places Hamilton suggests that the power of judicial review should exist, but it's not in the Constitution itself. So Marshall is looking for a way to assert this power, and he sees in this case a kind of genius opportunity. Because what he says is this. He says, Marbury, listen, man, I really think you deserve that appointment, but here's the thing. The law that gives me the authority to give you an appointment, that would be the Judiciary Act, which expanded the court system but also gave the Supreme Court some extra powers. Marshall says that law that gives me the power to help you out is unconstitutional. It gives me too much power. The Constitution doesn't say that I can get extra powers. It just says that we can create courts. So that law is unconstitutional. Therefore, I don't have any power to give you your appointment. Therefore, I'm sorry, Mr. Marbury, but you're out of luck. And it seems like a victory for the Democratic Republicans, right? Because Madison doesn't have to deliver the appointment. Jefferson gets to appoint his own person instead. That seems cool. But the real victor is the Supreme Court. because Marshall has now established judicial review as a precedent. He has made it clear that, look, the Supreme Court looked at a law and said it was unconstitutional. Everyone agreed. Yay! You might go, well, couldn't he have done it on any other case? But actually, no. What if the first time John Marshall had tried to assert that right, he had tried to invalidate some law of the Republican-controlled Congress? What might Congress have done? Just ignored him, right? What's he going to do about it? He doesn't have an army. So if Marshall had tried to establish this right of the Supreme Court to judicial review when looking originally for the first time at a law passed by Congress, they might have just ignored him. And then the Supreme Court would have been doomed to impotence for the rest of all eternity, right? They'd never have had any power. But because he established it as a precedent in a time where he had his own power to enforce, right? The person he was taking power away from was himself. He was declaring the Judiciary Act unconstitutional because it gave him in the Supreme Court too much power. That was the genius. So John Marshall is a brilliant politician who has found a way to establish a real power for the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Marbury versus Madison. The two words you need to associate with Marbury versus Madison: judicial review. Make sure you have those exact words written down. Marbury versus Madison establishes the power of judicial review. That is the power to declare the laws of the states or of the national government unconstitutional. So what else is going on in the courts? Well, kind of some interesting things. First of all, there's this guy down here. His name is Samuel Pickering, and he is an alcoholic. He is a judge, a lower court judge for the federal government, and he shows up to the bench on a regular basis completely drunk. And often he can be found in the town square like cursing and being super profane and just absolutely, he's like a horrible excuse for a human being. And so in 1803, he is impeached. Federal judges are appointed for life unless they resign or are impeached by the legislature. So the legislature impeaches them. They remove him from office. You're supposed to impeach people for crimes, for high crimes or misdemeanors to be specific. But they impeach him because he's like a bad person and he's drunk and whatever. He actually is a bad person, so nobody really says much about it. But then they go, all right, we did Pickering. How about Samuel Chase? This is Samuel Chase. And Chase was one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices. He was also a Federalist. But have you ever met anybody who, like, even when you agree with them, they kind of offend you? Right? Like, even if you're like, yeah, I agree with you, but what you just said is so wrong. You can't say it like that. You've got to be a little bit nicer about it. You know those people. Well, that's Samuel Chase. He was very strong in his opinions, and he would often write opinions for the court and like letters to the editor, basically articles that he'd send into newspapers that were really, really like anti-Republican. He spoke badly about Jefferson. He like made personal attacks against James Madison, you know, called them like whatever, all kinds of things that are not PG related or whatever. And so the Congress, the legislature, begins to target him. And they initiate impeachment proceedings against him. Except for that, is being offensive a crime? Does it make him a bad judge? Even if you disagree with his rulings, assuming that he's like looking at the law and has a justification for his rulings, it doesn't make him a bad judge. And so at some point, some of the Republicans in Congress say, you know what, this is wrong. We can't do this. We don't have a real reason to impeach him other than the fact that we don't like him. And what kind of precedent would that set? If we can impeach people just because we don't like them politically, that's going to mean that like the whole court itself will just be a pawn of whoever happens to be in control. That's a bad precedent. And so the impeachment proceedings fall through. They do not impeach Chase. And so this is another like American can sort of let the, you know, exhale a little bit. Okay, democracy's going to survive. We're not going to be crazy. What was your question? Who's what? The Supreme Court doesn't have a jury. It's a panel of justices, and they don't try, well, except in a few cases, they don't try like whether someone's guilty or not guilty or whether something happened or didn't. They're looking at the procedures of other courts or the procedures of passing a law. So they're not trying you like by a jury of your peers, not that kind of court. Okay, so moving on then, I guess I'll back up here. In 1804, Jefferson is reelected handily. Look who his opponent was, y'all. Pinckney, everybody's favorite. The Federalists still love Pinckney, but he's not going to win. Interestingly, we should see in these electoral college numbers some important things. Number one, Jefferson is a good president, right? The electors like him. He has been good for the country. He really is helping to bring the country together. He has not gone overboard trying to punish the Federalists. So that's good. Also, numerically, there are more Republicans than there are Federalists, right? You can kind of, I hesitate to say this, but you can kind of sort of compare it, the Democratic Republicans, to the Democrats today, not because their ideologies are alike at all, because they're really pretty different, but because the Democratic Republicans of that time were the party of Jefferson's time, were the party of immigrants, the party of minorities, the party of young people, the party of the lower middle class and the poor, right? And those tend to be majorities, right? There's lots more of those kinds of people than there are old rich white guys. So demographically, the Republican Party is benefiting. They clearly have a majority. Clearly, the Federalist Party is in trouble, right, if they're going to continue to get electoral college numbers like this. So anyway, okay, so what happens? Well, in 1808, as promised by the Constitution, what issue comes before the Congress? What about slavery? The international slave trade, right? The Constitution said we couldn't touch it for 20 years, but here it is 20 years later, and what do you think the very first thing Congress does? They end the international slave trade. So in 1808, Congress ends the importation of slaves to the United States. The South isn't overjoyed, but they're also not devastated. They knew this was coming. The South has for 20 years been importing as many slaves as they could, and the conditions of slavery in North America are different than elsewhere, and so slaves in North America have longer lifespans, and slave women in North America are reasonably successful at bearing children. Slave women in the Caribbean, for example, were so unhealthy they never had children, right? Those who ever became pregnant, which was very few, would lose their babies. It was almost no natural increase occurred in slavery in the Caribbean. But in the United States, we see lots of slave children being born, and slave owners are really careful with their slave women when they're pregnant because they realize how valuable of a commodity that is. So this sort of passes okay, but I have an interesting question for you. What happens if a slave ship shows up anyway in 1809? Well, you can't send them anywhere unless you pay for their voyage. Well, they show up. They just show up. I mean, we could just free them all. Right, but America isn't super big on freedom and equality for African Americans, so that's not going to be particularly a viable option. And if you free them, you still have to, again, you have to pay for the commodities. You have to pay the slaver. Can't kill them, right? So fundamentally what happens when slave ships just show up is they're just going to get smuggled in. So the slave trade really drops off. But there's not a lot there's not a lot the government can do to really enforce this ruling in a big way. So it's sort of interesting to see we're all gung ho about ending the importation of slaves, but we're not really sure what to do about it if it happens anyway. So let's see what else is going on at the time. Well, like pretty much every other time in world history, Britain and France are again at war. And again, it's drawing the United States into this conflict. And although both the British and the French are doing a terrible job of respecting our neutral trading rights, the British have a bigger and better navy, so the British are causing more problems, right? The French are not often on the high seas capturing American ships because their navies are really busy trying to defend their own ports. The French are not often boarding American vessels in the Caribbean because the French are busy defending their own ports, right? So I don't want you to get the idea that the French are being super nice to us at this point. They're just our problems with them are going to pale in comparison to our problems with the British because the British have a bigger presence worldwide because of the British Navy. So we're getting really frustrated, and Jefferson, who is really idealistic, remember he's not Hamilton, he doesn't believe in a big army, he's not Adams, he doesn't believe in a big navy. He thinks that we're going to solve all of our problems by holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and so he decides to declare an embargo. We're going to protect our national interests by refusing to trade with the British and the French because they're mean, and so we're going to take our toys and go home. Who does that hurt? Yeah, it hurts us way more than it hurts the British or the French. And who in America does that hurt the most? Merchants concentrate in New England, and New England tends to be politically leaning towards which party? this one's going to look bad. Jefferson's second term, as is common with most presidents, is going to be a whole lot less popular than his first term. Mostly because of this issue. The Federalists in New England are going to feel like the embargo that Jefferson declares is a partisan jab at them. It is way less partisan, let me tell you, than the Alien Sedition Acts were. He actually does have some logic behind his argument here, but it definitely does cripple the economy of the New England states. They enter into a period of depression that is that threatens the very foundation of their economy in the Northeast, and the entire country is going to hurt from this lack of trade. I will ask you to put a little asterisk there somewhere, because one of the long-term positive effects of this on New England is that because they had no other choice, the New England economy is going to move infinitesimally in the direction of industry, right? Prior to the embargo, we've been relying upon the British for industrial goods, right? That we were focusing on commerce, they provided the industrial goods or the proto-industrial goods. But because we now can't access their goods, the Americans are going to then move in that direction and begin to develop cottage industry systems, the putting out system, division of labor, and so on. So a little bit of positive news at the end. All right, we'll wrap up the rest tomorrow.